I usually start these videos talking about what kind of people are attracted to the army I'm talking about, but realistically, everyone involved in the Games Workshop sphere thinks about doing some kind of greenskin army at some point. It doesn't matter if you're into tokenized fantasy, dystopian futures, or nonsensical gibberish. At some point, you're going to get the urge to paint an orc army and make the questionable decision to buy a shirt with the orc war cry on it. So why do we all fall into this trap? My hypothesis? Their basis on English football culture comforts us because it reminds us of our drunken uncles, whose emotional well-being was entirely dependent on a sports team. Go Bills. So yeah, everybody thinks about starting an orc and goblin army at some point, but not everybody follows through. It's a big commitment, so hopefully this video will help give you the information you need to know to decide if this army is right for you. Starting with how they play on the tabletop, because I think it's one of their best aspects. Look, one of the more serious reasons why most people consider at least starting an orc army at some point is because traditionally they're one of the funnest armies to play against across all GW settings. Whether you're playing against hordes of fantasy orcs at constant risk of infighting, or against the green horde of techno raiders throwing buckets of dice to represent unreliable shooters, GW has constantly balanced the horror of a greenskin army against their own brand of orc silliness and randomness that makes them a real joy to play against. And I think the same sentiment holds true for the person piloting the army. Orcs and Goblins have not traditionally been a very powerful faction in Warhammer Fantasy, although in the old world they're probably the closest they've ever been, but they've always had a diverse range of options to field and a bit of randomness to them that has always attracted players looking for a good time. People more interested in a fun story rather than winning or losing. It's an army that allows you to play the villain, but still in a very fun-loving and jovial way, which is a very rare combination that actually feels really fun. And unique to this edition, or rebirth, whatever you want to call the old world, the randomness and drawbacks, such as animosity, have been toned down some, and the army has been better tuned around these drawbacks. Combined with a cost-effective core and strong gimmicks like Night Goblin Fanatics, Orcs and Goblins can field a wide variety of competitive lists or fluffy lists, depending on what you want to do, but all are fun to play, and all are fun to play against. In fact, I don't think any other faction has as much flexibility as Orcs and Goblins. The only ones that really come close are Empire and maybe the High Elves. You want an Orc-focused list? Done. You want a Goblin-focused list? That's great. Do you want them forest flavored or cave? Or maybe you want to mix it up and do a Boar Rider themed list to challenge the Bretonnians. The rules make that easy to do as well. Unfortunately, as of this recording, the pre-orders for the next Arcane Journal, Cetrus Fury, have gone out, and we now know that the rumors of an upcoming Savage Orc army list are not true. And this is devastating news if you want to play a cheeks out army that aren't Dark Elves. But although they aren't a part of this Arcane Journal, I personally still think they will come at some point. They would sell too well for GW not to go to that well at some point. They will at least get a made-to-order run, if not a straight-up army list in an Arcane Journal of some kind, is my guess. Until then, if you can get your hands on the sculpts, they still look amazing to mix in with your other units for a more horde-like look. But even if they don't come, the amount of choices you have when it comes to Orcs and Goblins can be staggering. And this is a joy for returning players and for people making their second or third or fourth army, but is an absolute boon for new players as well. If you're new to a rank and flank game and don't know what kind of playstyles you like yet, you can try a bit of everything of Orcs and Goblins and go with it. It's one of the few armies that can be played at least in a semi-competitive fashion with any kind of focus. This is great in contrast with, say, Bretonnians, who I really love, but can really only be played as Mountain Knights, just sometimes they have a slightly different seasoning. And I guess I should also point out some negatives of how they play on the tabletop, but the really only thing I can think of, it all goes back to that randomness. I get that dice rolling is a part of the game, and all factions suffer from randomness to a degree. You can mess up your combat rolls, your charge rolls, your magic rolls, whatever. But it's also true that some factions are affected more by randomness than others, and Orcs and Goblins are one of the factions that get affected by it more. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that there are a lot of ways to play Orcs and Goblins in at least a semi-competitive fashion, and I stand by that. But if you're really trying to min-max this army, you're going to be reliant on Night Goblin Fanatics. And these dice will eventually guide the fanatics back into your own army. It's going to happen to you at some point. There's really no way to avoid it. And I think for most players, for most people, that's fine. It really creates just a fun moment and a good laugh. But if you're one of those people that get angry when you feel like you outplayed your opponent and you only lost because of dice rolls, Orcs and Goblins might not be for you. And that's not to say that an Orcs and Goblin list can't do well in a tournament or hyper-competitive setting. They absolutely can. This is probably the most competitive an Orcs and Goblins list in Warhammer Fantasy has ever been, and that's really cool. But sometimes the dice giveth, and sometimes the dice taketh. Moving on to the models, I again have a lot to gush about and not a lot negative to say. First, I want to talk about the official models, and then I want to talk about third-party options. GW has always shown a lot of love for their Greenskins, and even if you just limit yourself to what they're selling consistently on their store, you have a lot of options with this army. And there are even more old models that they're not producing consistently. They're either doing made to order or just haven't been brought back yet. And for the most part, those are all pretty easy to find on eBay. One of the nice things about Orcs and Goblins is finding secondhand models for almost all of their units is really easy to do. The return of the old world has actually raised the price on a lot of these sculpts, but if you still want to get your hands on, say, the old Skarsnik, that can be done, and it's a lot less painful for Orcs and Goblins than for some other factions. Furthermore, Orcs and Goblin players are going to be spoiled by Age of Sigmar. There are multiple Greenskin factions in GW's latest setting, but honestly, they're not really that changed from what they were in Warhammer Fantasy. A lot of those sculpts could be used for heroes, for even units, pretty easily. There is a lot of runway here, both for creativity or for diversity's sake, probably more than any other faction. Another thing I love about these models, both the old sculpts and the new sculpts, is they are very forgiving for new painters. An Orc Horde army can look really good with really just some basic paint skills, and even a sloppy paint job doesn't look that bad within its context. In contrast, you have armies like Bretonnia, which really, when they're painted poorly, it really shows and it kind of takes away from the experience and is very discouraging for a new painter. But on the other hand, you can still show a great deal of skill with these models. They look good with a really basic paint job, but just the way they are designed, there's a lot of room for artistic expression in them. I feel like the ability to be both of those things is very unique to Orcs and Goblins. And if you're a good painter or a bad painter, you're going to get plenty of chances to practice, because one of the downsides of the Orcs and Goblins army is you're going to have to paint a lot of them. If you, for example, look through the latest tournament list posted online, most lists have at least 50 Night Goblins, and that's just Night Goblins. That makes up a tiny portion of the overall army. If you look at just the supported factions, Orcs and Goblins are de facto the Horde army, and 9 times out of 10, you're going to have to field more models than your opponent. And speaking from experience, painting up the first 10 Night Goblins are a lot of fun. Painting up the last 10 is absolute torture. But at least you have a lot of diversity to work with. You don't have to paint the same sculpt of Night Goblin over and over again, because not only do they officially have a lot of different sculpts to choose from, but Orcs and Goblins have a lot of third-party options as well. And third-party options have a lot of benefits. A, they're a little cheaper, but B, they add diversity to your army, which makes it look more realistic, more interesting. And the lovely thing about going third-party for greenskin miniatures is scale isn't that big of a deal. If you have a couple of orcs that tower over your others, or vice versa, it's really kind of fluffy. And even just limited to GW style, you have a massive amount of sculptors to choose from. And I'm not going to list them all here, but a couple of my favorites are Avatar of War and Highland Miniatures. In particular, I really love Avatars of War when it comes to orcs. They have a massive line, a lot of different options, and a great deal of the kits are modular for additional customization. They are also highly detailed for better or for worse, and by worse I mean all these additional details means even more time painting them up, which is already hard for a Horde army. In particular, I really love their boar riders, but keep in mind Avatar of War is a little bit bigger than GW, which is not the worst. They still blend pretty well, but if you want to match that scale more closely, I would print them at a slightly lower rate than 1.0. In contrast, Highland miniatures are much easier to paint. They have a much simpler aesthetic than Avatar of War, but they do have a different style thematically than GW. And these sculpts tend to have a straighter back, so they do stand taller to their GW counterparts. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing if you plan to pepper them in with your regular GW models. I do think the different aesthetics works for the Horde army, who are really just kind of scrapping things together rather than having a unified theme and say supply line. And both of these creators do both Savage Orcs and regular Orcs if you want to get both aesthetics and don't want to play GW's prices. The last thing to really touch upon is lore if that's meaningful to you. And Orcs and Goblins have a very interesting place within the Warhammer universe. The Elven factions, the Empire of Bretonnia, they all have very nationalistic origins. And by that I mean that their stories, their heroes, their history is really tied around their borders. But the lore behind Orcs and Goblins is more about cult of personalities. Basically, Orcs and Goblins are everywhere, and they're always a threat, but they're only a major threat when a great orc or a great goblin rise up and really start uniting the tribe. And so basically all of their lore is about these great orcs rising up, doing something chaotic and awesome, then dying in some fashion and their faction dispersing. There is really no singular thread that runs through them, which is interesting because it makes it really easy for you to tell your own story with your own guys, make your own warlord. If you want to contextualize your army within the old world lore, or Warhammer Fantasy lore in general, Azhag and Gorbat haven't risen to power yet, but according to the old world maps, their clans are active and currently pressuring the Empire. But as for the greatest war boss of this era, we have to look at Durgath Spinecracker. Located in the Grey Mountains, Spinecracker is currently terrorizing Bretonnia. This leads to King Lewin declaring an errantry war and earning the name Orcslayer as his army of knights sweeps the Orcs and Goblins out of the heartland of Bretonnia. And granted, when the old world came out, they already gave King Lewin the nickname the Orcslayer, so this is probably retconned a little bit. But the important bit is that this is the biggest war boss at the time, and he is currently a big threat to Bretonnia if you want to be a part of that for your army. And I highly suspect at some point, Spinecracker is going to get his own miniature. But in broad strokes, like I said before, Orcs and Goblins are literally everywhere in the old world. You can have your own army stationed anywhere, raiding anything, and it would make total and perfect sense. They're great for narrative campaigns in that way. They always fit no matter what. I realize a lot of this video is gushing, and that's because I believe that Orcs and Goblins are overall one of the easiest factions to start and one of the funnest factions to play. Not only will you have fun, but I think every gaming group benefits from having at least one Greenskin player. They're just fun on both sides.